Hello and welcome to Climate Culture, the Art of Becoming Sustainable, a series of online and physical events examining the role cultural institutions can and should play in combating the climate emergency. Climate Culture is curated and produced by Onassis Stegi in collaboration with Julie's Bicycle. This panel addresses the theme of climate justice, one of the most critical, yet perhaps less understood dimensions of the challenges we face, not only because of the climate emergency, but also when devising equitable ways of implementing solutions to it. It's well known that the communities and regions that are hardest hit by the consequences of climate change and environmental degradation are often those that are least responsible and have the least capacity to counteract them. Responsibility for causing environmental damage and responsibility for responding to it should go together. Communities and individuals who do not have the capacity to shoulder the burden of addressing the climate emergency and who often are less responsible for causing it should not be disproportionately tasked with doing so. Policies need to take these imbalances into account. Cultural organizations need to make these basic principles of climate justice a central dimension of their creative work and communication content, alongside operational changes and more general narratives related to the climate emergency. Climate injustice leads to the forced disruption and displacement of communities, and this will increase significantly over the coming years. Cultural organizations have an important role to play in making sure that these communities have a voice and a place within their spaces and programs. Climate injustice and coloniality go hand in hand, both because coloniality is based on an extractive system and because it has very frequently completely destabilized local culture environment balances and resulted in the suppression of local forms of knowledge related to the natural world and humanity's place in it. As cultural actors, one of our roles is to give a voice to these endangered cultural systems. And finally, a diverse set of actors, communities, civil society, states, intergovernmental organizations, the private sector, and NGOs are actively working together on a vast spectrum of current and future challenges related to climate change and climate justice. Cultural organizations and artists should reflect on how they can join, strengthen, or initiate new collaborative efforts drawing on their specific perspectives, skills, and areas of expertise. Today, we're honored to host a panel discussion between four very knowledgeable, experienced, and engaged speakers. And in order of their initial presentation, Baroness Lola Young, who after an extensive career in acting became a professor of cultural studies, a writer, broadcaster, and cultural critic. She's been an independent crossbench member of the House of Lords since 2004, after serving as head of culture at the Greater London Authority for 2 years. She's been on the boards of numerous arts and cultural organizations, including the National Theatre, Historic England, and the South Bank Centre. Lola has tackled racial disparity in the criminal justice system and services for women and girls at risk. She's the vice chair of the all-party parliamentary group on Looked After Children. While campaigning for the elimination of modern slavery in supply chains, Lola founded and co-chairs all-party parliamentary groups on ethics and sustainability in fashion and on sport, modern slavery, and human rights. Since 2018, Lola has been co-chair of the Foundation for Future London. She was appointed Chancellor of the University of Nottingham and a non-executive director of Bloomsbury Publishing in 2020. Farhana Yamin is an internationally recognized environmental lawyer, climate change policy expert, and activist. For 30 years, she has provided high-level strategic and legal advice to leaders of vulnerable countries and was lead author of 3 assessment reports for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. She's also credited with getting the goal of net zero emissions by 2050 into the 2015 Paris Agreement, after which Mrs. Yamin founded Track Zero. In 2018, she joined Extinction Rebellion as coordinator of the political strategy team and played a central role in the rebellion, including getting arrested in April 2019 for gluing herself to the headquarters of the oil giant Shell. She now remains a member of Extinction Rebellion's International Solidarity Network and is an associate fellow at Chatham House, a senior advisor for Systemic, a trustee for Greenpeace UK and Julie's Bicycle, and a member of the programme committee of the World Wildlife Fund UK. Giorgos Kallis is an ecological economist, political ecologist, and Catalan Institution for Research and Advanced Studies professor at the Institute of Environmental Science and Technology in Barcelona. He's the author of Limits, Why Malthus Was Wrong and Why Environmentalists Should Care, published by Stanford University Press in 2019, and The Case for Degrowth, published by Polity Press in 2020. He was previously a Marie Curie Fellow at the Energy and Resources Group at UC Berkeley, and he holds a PhD in environmental policy from the University of the Aegean, an MSc in economics from Universitat Pompeu Fabra, and an MSc in environmental engineering and a bachelor's in chemistry from Imperial College London. Finally, Hannah Entwisle Chapuisat is co-founder and curator of the art project Displacement, Uncertain Journeys, director of the Swiss Association at La Fruitière, and a doctoral candidate at the University of Arts London, Chelsea College of Arts. She's also a lawyer by training, with over 15 years of experience working with the United Nations, states, and non-governmental organizations on operational and policy issues related to humanitarian affairs and the protection of displaced people. Hannah is currently bridging these two worlds by exploring how contemporary art practice and research can contribute to the development of international law and policy to protect the rights of people displaced by disasters and climate change. It's a great pleasure to have you all here with us for this panel. And without further ado, Lola, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Christos. It's a huge pleasure to be here, wherever here is for everybody this morning, if it's morning with you. I'm delighted to be able to open this session today, partly because I'm normally asked to talk about legislation and policy and strategy and regulatory frameworks. And it's a welcome change for me to be able to think a little bit differently, to contribute in a slightly different way. So what I want to do is lay the ground for something that's a little bit speculative, a little bit theoretical, a little bit abstract maybe, in the knowledge that I know we're going to drill down to some hard practicalities as we move along. So forgive me if I look at my notes in order to remember and to try and keep to time. I want to start by paraphrasing a quotation that I came across quite recently, which says, I'm going to say, the true beginning of the Anthropocene is the European colonization project. So I've slightly amended that quotation. And I note that Christos mentioned colonization in his opening remarks. So my question to myself is, can we reimagine by looking back at history, looking back at the past, I should say, and reframing our historical knowledge about the past in order to understand fully how we got to where we are today? Because it's no accident. It's not something that just suddenly popped up. It's something that's been a long time in the making. And I'm not sure that everybody is quite aware of this. Obviously, colonialism and the historical past has come under huge scrutiny thanks to Black Lives Matter and other movements and organizations and individuals and academics and researchers that are saying, let's look again at this past and what it means. We've been familiar with the arguments about colonialism, but from a slightly different perspective. So what I would want to say is that colonialism has normalized the extraction of resources for financial profit without being bothered by the unethical nature of abusive and exploitative labor systems, and without being bothered by the degradation of the environment. And that's been a feature of colonialism throughout its history. In fact, the people who were required to carry out the job of extraction were simply seen as goods and objects themselves, another non-human resource. So we know why history is important, because it's so hotly contested, and particularly at the moment with the pushing back from movements like Black Lives Matter, like Extinction Rebellion, like LGBTQI plus movements. There's a huge reaction against that, and that's only to be expected. To me, that's a signal that we're kind of making some real points and getting home to people. But this kind of, I often feel that these debates about, we shouldn't be pulling statues down, or yes, we should be pulling statues down, we've got to rename this street, or no, we shouldn't rename this street, is a kind of distraction. It's a distraction from the realities of the past, and it's a distraction from the situation where we're in now, where these same processes, these same practices, albeit mutated, because we have more knowledge, we have the technology, we have the machinery in all senses of the word to make this look as though it's something much more benign and look as though we're doing something that's really, really progressive. And when I say we, I'm kind of saying all of us as humans, although, you know, I'm really ready to point the finger at big business, at corporates and at governments who fail to live up to the promises that they make to us around these issues. So there's a sense in which we've poked the slightly dopey bear and it's now come out to try and work against us. And how does this work in relation to cultural artifacts and the whole arena of culture? Well, let's be clear, we've only got to look at our museums in Britain, in the UK, and see that this plundering, this extraction extends to cultural goods and artifacts too. And, you know, it's also the point that not only are they have they been extracted like the Benin bronzes from their points of origin, plundered from these communities, but they're not even accorded the kind of value, or at least initially they weren't even accorded the value of being on an equal footing to European notions of culture and civilization. So, and that primitivist discourse that runs throughout the ways in which those kinds of cultural artifacts have been framed is also rampant today. And we can see this in language and in various discourses. One of the things I always like to try and draw in something around popular culture. And I was thinking back to Black Panther, the movie that was a huge hit back in the days when we used to be able to go to cinemas a couple of years or so ago. And I think it had quite a significant impact for lots and lots of very obvious reasons. But one of the things that struck me was in this invented, thriving land of Wakanda, invented, of course, was this idea that the civilization was technologically hugely advanced, in fact, in advance as anything else. And that was because colonialism hadn't touched them. They'd managed to hide away in this wonderful Marvel universe. They'd managed to hide away and pretend, as it were, adopt a cloak of lack of civilization and lack of resources so that nobody would come along and plunder what they had. And I just thought it was a really interesting concept because at the same time as being absolutely made in the present, it's looking back and offering a critique of colonialism in lots of very funny ways. But it's also kind of reimagining what a future might be, could be. Now, obviously, it's not without its problems. There's lots of fighting and lots of other things going on. But it's just that sort of sense of having control of the way in which we think about the future. And if you look back to the golden age of science fiction that I used to love when I was a kid, you know, Black women, you know, brown, all those people were out of the picture unless they were kind of serving or servile. And this brave new future that was being imagined in those works was all about the primacy, the supremacy and the superiority of white males. So we had this kind of masters of the universe complex coming from Europeans, again, throughout sort of history, and it's reflected in both popular culture and in what we used to call high culture. Now, the arguments about history are very interesting. And I've heard people say, oh, you can't change history, so there's no point in sort of reimagining or trying to review our statues and all these monuments to these great colonial iconic characters. And, you know, the answer to that is very simple. We can change history. We do it all the time. We can't change the past, but we can change the way in which we frame that past. And that's what history does. And to pretend it's some kind of objective scientific framework that everybody sat down and agreed to is a nonsense, as most historians, if you press them, are able to admit. So the idea is then, as I say, to kind of rethink the history, look at where the strands of the current situation are coming from. And that should help us to think about what kinds of questions we should be asking. Because maybe some part of our problem is we're not asking the right question. So we've got a history, yes, that's full of technological genius and inventive genius and economic genius and money-making genius. But yes, and some of those features are obviously very clear in the colonial project. but they're also clear in that project is the destruction, the degradation, and the devastation that's been wrought on communities and whole populations, and which have led to the kind of poverty that we see today, the kinds of continued rampant extraction from those whole continents like Africa or South America and other regions. And so where we are is in a very, very difficult place, because it feels to me like, you know, we put the bullet in the gun and we're standing looking at the barrel and still saying, oh, what should we do? What should we do? Oh, no, we've got to deliver financial profit for our shareholders. That is totally not on, because soon there won't be any shareholders if we carry on the way that we are and don't immediately fast track how we think about the environment and nature around us. And I think my final comment would be, I'm not into romanticizing the relationship between so-called underdeveloped countries and nature, but there's no question in my mind but that we've become so divorced in Western European and American economies where the wealth is taken for granted by a certain clique of people. We've completely lost that connection with land, trees, plants. People don't even know where carrots come from or what they look like when they come out of the ground. There's no kind of relationship to food in a way that would make us more respectful of that as something that we need to do. So I think we need a whole kind of cultural turnaround, and artists and creatives are really well placed to help that turnaround, in fact, to lead that turnaround. And that's what I would ask of our community, if you like, our global community today, that we help to lead on alerting people to what we should really be talking about and which differences matter and which don't. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lola. That was a really stimulating start to our discussion and underlining the fundamental responsibility of capitalism and colonialism and their relationship, which we'll come back to, I'm sure, when we have our discussion. Farhana, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Well, tomorrow is, in fact, Earth Day. I'm not sure when the podcast will go out. And tomorrow is also the day in which the jury, which is trying the activists who protested at Shell, is going to give its verdict in the UK courts. So I didn't get charged for my protest at Shell headquarters, but the other activists did. So I'm very conscious and reflecting on both the Earth Day, which is, I think, more than 50 years old now, and on the events that took place in this country 2 years ago, and which have been replicated in many parts of the world, where young people, old people, mothers, grandmothers, grandfathers, activists from all sides, people who've never protested, marched in the streets of London, and thousands were arrested in protest at climate injustice. And I'm very grateful also to Lola for putting in this historical perspective. We will be hosting in this country, in the UK, in November of this year, the delayed COP26, the 26th meeting of the Conference of the Parties, the COP. And it will be also, for me, very significant. I've attended nearly every single one of these COPs and most of the UN summits in between since 1991, when I started my own legal career. So the COP is coming home to the UK. And I think the day of reckoning, the day of understanding of what our history and our paradigm and our model of economic and social development has been, is also coming with it. So I think of this COP in Glasgow, this UN summit in Glasgow, not just as a moment for countries to technically update their national action plans, which is what they're required to do every 5 years under the Paris Agreement, which was negotiated in 2015, but as a much bigger 400-year cycle event of that significance, of the way in which different understandings now inform the way in which we celebrate the leadership of some or diminish the leadership of others. And that's what I want to tie into my talk about climate justice. So climate justice doesn't feature as a term in the climate change. This is my battered copy that I've had actually for about 25 years or so. It doesn't feature in the climate change negotiations, and the negotiations took place from essentially 1989 through to 1992 under the auspices of the UN. And they took place in parallel with the negotiations of what we call the Biodiversity Convention and what we also called Agenda 21 and another legal agreement, which is called the Forest Principles, which was originally intended to be a treaty covering the Amazons and tropical forests, but which the countries that had tropical forests at that time said, no, thank you, we don't want a treaty covering just our forests. So it just became a set of principles. And those were all negotiated as a common package that was presented to the 1992 Environment and Development Summit in Rio, which I attended as a much younger lawyer with a full head of, jet black hair. And at that time, the global south, the countries who had essentially been colonized and who are called developing countries and see themselves still in the process of development and see themselves essentially as a bloc, were much more unified, this 30 years ago than maybe they are now, when countries like China and India and South Africa and Brazil, for example, now have broken away, and when you have the Asian tigers. But at that time, 30 years ago, there was a very clear division in the world, and that division was very marked by the history of essentially colonialism and imperialism, which goes hand in hand with it, because there is no way that the indigenous people and the people whose lands were invaded gave their resources freely. So these were taken forcibly, these resources. So the Global South negotiated all of these conventions that date from the 1990s and their successor agreements. The successor agreement is the Kyoto Protocol, which I also have from 1997, on the basis of a fundamental set of principles based on climate justice, based on the understanding that we are not all in the same boat as regards the impacts of climate devastation, as well as the impact of continuing wasteful consumption lifestyles, and as regards the historic and current contributions. So the very first and most fundamental principles of all of these conventions is something called the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and capabilities, respective capabilities, and equity. Equity is a word which encompasses the notions of fairness and of justice. And the primary way in which the law, international law, gave expression to climate justice was to require developed countries, the richer countries, essentially Europe, the former Soviet Union, and the US, New Zealand, Australia, the countries that were, and still are predominantly white majority countries. It required these countries to take leadership, and it required these countries to negotiate targets for themselves to cut greenhouse gases or to take the lead in protecting biodiversity, and to essentially give the developing countries a grace period, which was undefined in the case of the Climate Convention. In the Montreal Protocol, for the ozone layer, there was a 10-year period, and roughly developing countries said, you have caused this problem, the cumulative emissions from the industrial period, the deforestation that has happened to date is what is actually up there in our atmosphere, changing our climate, and you should take the leadership and responsibility for it. And developed countries, the richer countries, accepted that. That is the fundamental, heart of the bargain. They accepted that they had a greater share of responsibility for fixing the problem. They tended to say, actually, we got greater resources. We'd rather not acknowledge our historical role, but we're very happy to acknowledge that we have greater resources. So sort of like drawing a veil over historically why they got rich, the process of which they got rich. And I think what's happening now is an uncovering and a new generation of activists, a new generation of people, especially younger people, are decoding this history, understanding what it means for me to walk past statues every day in London, in any other city, to walk in the port cities that prospered from slavery, and to not ask questions of why we celebrate in our culture, in the living environment that we walk through, where that wealth comes from. Why is it that we've been able in the UK and many of the Western countries to bail out, our entire economies, because our financial infrastructure is so robust as to allow us trillions of pounds to be taken out and funded by treasuries, and why we cannot, why developing countries cannot do the same. So these are the historical ways in which climate justice has been handled, and with a requirement that both richer countries lead and that richer countries pay the way for the transition of vulnerable countries. And the great disputes in recent years and the need for a new treaty, the Paris Agreement, has come because of fairness, because principally the richer countries, led by the US, have said, we are no longer willing to accept this leadership role. We think that China, India, Pakistan, Nigeria, Saudi Arabia, all of these countries, even though they have lower emissions historically, should take a greater role, and that they should bear the costs of their own development pathways from now on. This is the big underlying dispute. At this COP, one of the biggest issues will be loss and damage. We have already gone past the 1.1 degree threshold. I've worked, as I said, for 30 years, and developing countries, especially the vulnerable countries I represent, have been asking for the science-based target of 1.5 degrees as the lower and safer of the thresholds that the world should unite behind, which meant back in 2015, a rapid phase out at the global level by 2050 to net zero globally. Not that richer countries should have that as the goal. The richer countries should do a much greater proportion according to the fair shares principle, according to the equity principles enshrined in all of these treaties. So wrapping up now, I think one of the issues that is coming front and center is the accountability, the liability, the culpability, the sense of injustice, the demand for reparations. These are the words, these are the justice-related words that are much more prevalent and being spoken of now than was the case in my day early on, when we were trying to prevent this horrendous problem. We didn't know that it was going to take this long to fix the problem. This was a problem that could have been solved and prevented. And so we're at the point now where the damage is being done, has been done, is going to continue, as the report from the IEA yesterday, which got a bit buried amongst other news, that the rebound effect of COVID financial stimulus packages is not to build back better, but in fact, our emissions are going to go through the roof, frankly, which has led me to a great deal of despair and feeling that my own personal now, and here, Christos, that my own personal story is now dealing primarily with the reckoning, rather than focusing now on preventing the damage. I'm not saying we shouldn't do that. Of course we should do that. But personally, my life story is to do with tracking down, highlighting the reason why we failed, and holding those who stood in the way, who knew. Shell knew 40 years ago, Exxon knew 40 years ago. These big companies funded a campaign of greenwashing, denial, misleading the public and politicians. Since 2015, the top 5 oil and gas companies, have spent $1 billion on greenwashing, lobbying and marketing. And that was my motivation, my trigger finally for gluing myself to Shell. Like, since 2015, guys, this is what you're going to do. This is your response to this new treaty that was taken us a decade to agree. So I think I'm going to end it there, but I think these are the issues that will bring together, I think, all of the different strands of injustices, the systemic injustices that have been committed against the global South, against Indigenous people, against local communities, against primarily people of color who were colonized and who have now, stand to find ourselves in a position, frankly, of climate apartheid. That's not my word, that's the words of a UN Human Rights Special Rapporteur. Climate apartheid, where some people, some economies will be protected as a result of accumulated wealth based on the past, and others will be left to cope with ecologic devastation. So I'll end it there. I know that's not a very hopeful note, but I hope, I am hopeful that, change is happening, and it's happening much quicker and swifter, and our young people and our spirited social movements are uniting and understanding that all of our struggles are deeply linked.
Well, Farhana, thank you very much for that very powerful presentation. I think you're absolutely right. The moment we're at now is very, very critical, leading also up to the Glasgow meeting. And whereas many of us during the initial phase of the pandemic had hoped that this would be a wake-up call at this level as well as so many others, we're now beginning to realize that, in fact, it's not at all clear, in fact, possibly the contrary, that the awareness of what we need to do has really sunk in. And as you say, it looks as though this kickstarting of the economy might actually lead to higher emissions than even before the pandemic. So it's a very critical moment, and we can come back in our discussion as to what people can do about that, especially, as you said, there's a sort of divide between the younger generation who really have taken this on board and others. And anyway, we'll come back to all this. George, Kallis, over to you to talk a bit about precisely this theme of capitalism and growth and its role in what we are experiencing as a climate emergency.
Thank you, Christos. Thank you, everyone. It's an honor and pleasure to be with you, with all of you. I want to share a few ideas from my recent book on limits that you mentioned, Christos, at the beginning. I think they relate to this conversation, and they relate a little bit with some thoughts on the role that art and culture could play. I think I'll shift a little bit to a little bit more conceptual philosophical level, and I hope you will excuse me for that. I fully share the urgency of the climate breakdown in front of us, but not only climate, many other issues. But I want a little bit to reflect on some of the fundamental premises and type of thinking or imaginaries, as we might call them, of capitalist civilization that are intertwined with our current predicament. So a premise of my book is that we live in an age of limits, but we don't know how to limit ourselves. And by we, I mean the global north principally. I mean the places where I've lived, which is Europe and North America. We live in an age of limits in the sense of the things we've been talking about right now. The climate breakdown is an obvious and urgent limit. But not only that, we know about biodiversity loss, we know about water depletion, land use depletion, problems of agriculture. But also in a more general sense, we live in an age of limits that the space and the pace of the initial expansion that started with capitalism and colonization and was predicated on colonization has reached its natural limit. I mean, economies cannot grow 3% forever because, you know, within a century, this means economy is 12 times bigger, and within 2 centuries, it goes to infinity. So this thing naturally slows down. But the problem is that capitalism cannot slow down. It can only expand. It can make profit and invest it and make more profit. And the thing is that as it naturally slows down, the only way that it can respond to as a system is by exploiting more intensively nature and exploiting more intensively those that it can exploit, and they are the workers in other parts of the world, but also the workers increasingly within the capitalist core. I wrote that in 2019, so it was a little bit, it was before the pandemic, which I couldn't, of course, foresee, and it was completely out of my radar and line of thinking at the time. But I think it kind of speaks also, the pandemic is like a micro situation of the bigger condition we are facing. What I said, that we live in an age of limits, but we don't know how to limit ourselves. Because the pandemic was an external limit that was born through our interaction with the external world. So, I mean, we created the disease. It was a disease that was a side effect of our system, our encroachment into forests, the fast globalization and traveling, etc. And it was a limit that came externally to us. Was like, you know, you can't do that because you're going to start dying by the millions as it happened. But we didn't know how to handle that. We didn't know. There was a reluctance to close airports fast at the beginning. Only a few countries were very decisive at the beginning, and they are the ones who are doing also better now. And in general, there was a reluctance to doing anything that would, let's say, compromise the dominant way of living, the prevalent way of living, the way the economy functions. Any way of limiting any of that was out of the question. And governments, ourselves, we were trying to handle that without changing anything. And we saw that this didn't work, and we were forced at the end to impose limitations very sketchily and not so effectively. The big picture, of course, is climate change, where we haven't done any progress. Farhana just said how badly we're doing. And I think the pandemic is just like the alarm of this bigger question that, unfortunately, again, we don't show any capacity of doing what is needed and limiting our fossil fuel use. But by limiting our fossil fuel use, limiting also many other things that we take for granted and that cannot continue without using fossil fuels. So in my book, I take a historical perspective and I see how from the very beginning of capitalist civilization, let's say 18th century England, and that's why I focus on the figure of Malthus, who was a priest, who was also the first professional economist. So he marks this transition from an age of religion to an age of economics. Economics is the new religion, I argue in the book. It's a religion of growth, it's a religion of constant expansion. Capitalist civilization has a dual, let's say, contradictory but productive for itself relationship with the idea of limits. So on the one hand, is the very first civilization that considers Earth as and land as something that it's by its nature limited. If we look at indigenous civilization, if we look at ancient civilizations, this idea that the world is limited didn't exist. If you can go to the poorest people, for example, in the Congo Basin, which is an example I take from an anthropologist friend who has worked with communities there for ages, and they believe that their forest is abundant and they trust that it will give what they need and that they will take it from that. Then come, of course, the NGOs and the corporations, and they say, oh, this is limited, there are endangered species, there are trees that they're going to run out and we need to log them sustainably, etc. So this idea of scarcity is a very particular idea, this idea of the world as being limited, that appears with capitalism and appears in the moment that there is an unprecedented growth in the amount of material goods being produced. And I argue in my book that it's a dual relationship. So capitalism needs the specter of limits in order to justify its constant quest for expansion and colonization. Because if something is limited, you know, you need to go out of that. We are caught in this way of thinking. Even the way I mean, I don't put myself in, but I say the dominant way of approaching climate change is a way of going beyond it, you know, like geoengineering or finding new energy sources that they will do the trick, you know. Or in the most extreme version, you know, we have also the escapist plans now, the new colonization, at least it's imaginary, but it shows like what's the dominant imaginary, which is to escape Earth and go to moon, no? In my book, I argue that this is the dominant way of thinking in economics. For those of you who might have studied or touched upon economics, you know that scarcity is the basic starting point of modern economics. So it's the premise that we want too much and there is not enough. So how do we handle that is the job of economics. And basically the answer is growth, you know, it's efficiency, growth, etc. But unfortunately, I say in my book, it's also it's also the way of thinking of environmentalists upon which I put myself, and I know that my own of thinking has been colored by that. Because our way of thinking has been colored by the idea of planetary boundaries, the Earth is limited. So unwarrantedly, we reproduce this Malthusian way of thinking that the planet is limited and that it asks from us to do something. In my book, I argue instead that a much more productive and progressive and potentially environmentally just approach of thinking of limits is as a request of us to do something different. So it is us who should limit ourselves. It is that we should be aware of the pleasure and the justice of limits. And I make a case for what I call collective self-limitation in the name of avoiding future disasters, in the name of solidarity with the rest of the world, to take a Gandhian dictum here, living simply so that others may simply live. And in the sense also of, paradoxically, given how we have come to think about limits, in the sense of freedom, because I argue without limiting ourselves, there is not real freedom. Artists know that pretty well now, that in many arts, the most basic skill is how to limit yourself, how not to do excess. And every art is an art of limitation. Painting has a canvas. Piano, which is the metaphor I use in my book, has a limited keyboard, it's not infinite. So I argue for limitation also in the name of freedom. So final point, how does this relate to art? I'm an environmental scientist, so I didn't think about art and culture, but somehow my work and writing this book brought me to culture without me asking for it. So I tried to look for a civilization that in which this demand for self-limitation was strong and powerful. And I chose one among many. I mean, we could go to Eastern philosophies, we can go to many pre-capitalist civilizations and find that. But I went to the one that it's closer to my heart and to my knowledge, and it's the ancient Greece, classical Greece. And I found that self-limitation and the idea of limits was very powerful. So it was powerful in philosophy, was powerful in institutions, and crucially, it was powerful in arts and culture. So the whole notion of the whole art of tragedy was based on lessons about the inevitable disaster that comes by people pursuing their own goals without any limit. So this made me think in relation, what is our dominant type of art form right now, and what messages does it send? And I started thinking about the Hollywood movies. And it's not an accidental that this type of art is coming from the so-called Far West, which was the edge point of colonization, of the process of the colonization of Americas, and which in its art that has been universalized and shaped the thinking of so many people around the world, is reproducing this basic colonial pattern, which has the individual protagonist who faces a limit early in the movie or in the plot, and then this individual protagonist, through a series of battles, at the end overcomes this limit, beats it. This limit is metaphorically always death, someone bad who wants to kill you, it's like the bad is the death, and at the end overcomes it and goes beyond the limit. So one lesson I got from my book, and it was not one I was searching for, is that we really need to rethink and rediscover new forms of culture and of art that bring back this notion of limit and of self-limitation, of the tragedy of pursuing our limits without an end. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Giorgos. Issues that go, as you say, very much to the heart of the way our whole economy and society works. And I'm sure there's a lot to discuss about how one sells the notion of limits also to a public. How do you make a public engage with the notion of self-limitation, as well as what other implications they might have, but certainly very crucial issues. So on now to the last speaker for this first part of our discussion, before we get on to the discussion per se and questions we might have for each other. Hannah, the floor is yours, and I think you have something to present as well.
Thank you, Christos, for the invitation, and I'm also really thankful to be here on this panel. It's great to be here with you. Today, I'm sharing a practical example about how artists and cultural organizations can contribute to the international response to climate change. and in particular, the protection needs of people displaced by the impacts of climate change. So we know that some 23 million people are newly displaced each year by disasters, far exceeding those displaced by conflict. And we also know that in the absence of action, climate change is expected to only make those numbers increase. And although a number of states, international organizations, non-governmental organizations are working hard to find solutions for disaster displaced people, and ideally to avoid future displacement, it's a very complex policy area. So the art project I'm presenting today, called Displacement Uncertain Journeys, is grounded in my initial training as a lawyer and my work with the United Nations and others, addressing disaster displacement from a policy and operational perspective. And it also draws on my doctoral research in contemporary art practice at the University of the Arts London. I initiated the project because I felt that art could help address both the factual and emotional elements of displacement that were difficult for me to convey in written reports. However, I was aware that art was virtually absent from international policy debates on disaster displacement. I think this quote from art critic and curator Lucy Lepar is a good introduction to the project's underlying philosophy. There's no reason to exaggerate the elusive power of art. Artists cannot change the world alone, but when they make a concerted effort, they collaborate with life itself. Displacement Uncertain Journeys is a collaborative project. We work in partnership with artists, states, NGOs, academic institutions, and UN organizations to create opportunities to understand disaster displacement from a visual, experiential, and emotional perspective. What makes displacement distinct is that we develop art interventions addressing themes related to disaster displacement for policymakers rather than the general public. The project also engages wider questions about how states come to agree upon international law and policy, and what role artists and art might play in that process. Artists have not been widely recognized as active participants in international policy-making processes. In places like the United Nations office in Geneva, art has historically served as a backdrop for international diplomacy, with some seeing art as a catalyst to inspire collaboration and creativity in seeking solutions to the world's most pressing challenges. And in the field of international politics in particular, art and cultural events are often understood as a source of soft power and cultural diplomacy for states to achieve their broader foreign policy objectives. However, there's a little recognition of art directly contributing to international policymaking in its own right. At its core, the Displacement Project is an experiment in how to bring art to bear on specific policy issues. We formally created the project in 2015 when I was working as a research officer with the Nansen Initiative, which is a group of states that was concerned about disaster displacement issues. And we developed a partnership with the now late Professor Chris Wainwright and his team from the University of the Arts London. Building on Chris's leadership as an artist, curator, and professor addressing environmental issues, we developed ideas for how to integrate artworks and art research within intergovernmental conferences. Continuing in his memory, the project is now hosted by a Swiss art association I co-founded called La Fruitière, working primarily with the Platform on Disaster Displacement, which continues the prior work of the state-led Nansen Initiative. I'm also grateful for the ongoing support from the Norwegian Refugee Council, the University of the Arts London, and the Humanitarian Collaborative at the University of Virginia, among others. We've done some more traditional exhibitions, such as this exhibition commissioned by the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction in 2019. The exhibition along the Lake Geneva border featured 9 artists whose work addressed themes related to displacement and disaster risk. However, what we try to do is bring art into the very heart of intergovernmental conference spaces. So we love artworks that directly engage delegates and help prompt conversations. Here at the Global Forum on Migration and Development in Marrakesh, artist Soren Dahlgaard invited civil society delegates to carry his inflatable island as a symbol of all people who may be forced to leave their homes because of climate change. Here you can see an installation of Lucy and Jorge Orta's Antarctic Village No Borders and the Antarctica World Passport Bureau, located in the heart of the conference center. Well over 1,000 conference delegates lined up to receive a stamped copy of the Orta's Antarctica World Passport, an artistic proposal to address climate change related displacement by facilitating visa-free travel to any country in the world. A big part of our project is not only showing artwork, but also facilitating direct conversations between artists and policymakers. So here you can see Soren discussing his work with delegates in Marrakesh. We've also screened short films during conference meetings. For example, at the UN Climate Change Conference in Madrid, COP25, we held a number of events in collaboration with COL, an arts organization in Paris addressing environmental issues. Here you can see a film by the artistic duo Honey and Bunny, projected during an event organized by the UN Task Force on Displacement. During the 3 events at the French Pavilion in the Blue Zone during the climate conference, we also featured the work of the 10 2019 COL Prize finalists and facilitated conversations with delegates to reflect on the relevance of the artworks to the climate negotiations. The 2019 COL Prize winners, Lena Dobrowolski and Theo Ormanskiping, also had a dedicated brainstorming session with delegates about how to develop the storyline for their upcoming film, You Never Know, One Day You Too May Become a Refugee. And although these pictures might not look very exciting, for me, this is one of our most successful events in that we created an opportunity for meaningful exchange between the artists and the delegates to discuss how artists could contribute to international policy making on disaster displacement. In sum, our displacement interventions have sought to give visibility to disaster displacement in busy conference spaces by creating opportunities for informal exchange and reflection on the complex topic of disaster displacement. We've also sought to provide opportunities for delegates to explore the nuances and subtleties of disaster displacement through works that appeal to emotions and create embodied experiences. While we're only just beginning in these efforts, I'm encouraged by other emerging opportunities that show how art can be more than just a backdrop for international policymaking. For instance, the UN Special Rapporteur in the field of cultural rights recently presented a report to the UN Human Rights Council highlighting the role that socially engaged art practices are playing in protecting human rights in various post-conflict countries. UNESCO's Art Lab is promoting artistic research and policy development and project delivery. Finally, as an observer to the UN-affiliated International Seabed Authority, the TBA 21 Academy is able to submit its interdisciplinary artistic research on oceans to the intergovernmental body. With this in mind, I am reflecting on what it means to create policy-oriented artistic practice as a contribution to international policymaking. In my role as a curator, bridging the world of art and international policymaking, I've been looking for a broad group of artists that can speak to the geographic diversity and complexities of disaster displacement as a policy issue. At the same time, I found it important for policymakers to be able to easily engage with the artworks, recognizing that international conferences are busy contexts where viewing art is not seen as the first priority. That said, we're working to give artists and artworks more space in the conference format so that delegates have time to engage more deeply with the artworks. And finally, on a more practical level, curating in this context also requires extreme flexibility, since many intergovernmental events are finalized at the last minute, which poses challenges for exhibition design and financing. So I'm going to conclude here, but I look forward to continuing the discussion. And I'd also like to invite you to explore our website so you can see more examples of the artists that participate in the project. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hannah, for your presentation and your slideshow. It's very interesting to see this work actually at the place where policy is being developed. And I'm sure we can come back to this in our discussion. Well, thank you all very, very much for those incredibly interesting and powerful presentations. I think that in the framework of our meeting today and our discussion today, which is focusing on the role of cultural institutions, it would be great to hear from you very specifically about this, because cultural institutions are also in a very fluid state at the moment from many perspectives. I mean, on the one hand, over the past years, at least to my mind, the arts organizations have been more powerfully brought into political discussions than at many other phases in the past, be it Black Lives Matter, be it climate crisis, be it the precarity of the working conditions within the cultural industry in various forms. So there's been a very strong engagement of cultural institutions in the public space, whether they like it or not. And on the other hand, cultural institutions are also, to my mind, again, becoming very much more like media institutions. I mean, we've been basically broadcasting for a year and a bit now, and the way people consume culture already before the pandemic, but especially now, has become a much more fluid mix of online, social media, mainstream media, more narrowly focused, let's say, interest groups and what have you. But the fact of the matter is that as cultural institutions, we are very much responsible for getting not only artistic content, but getting generally ideas, initiatives out there. So I'd very much like to hear from you all about how you see the responsibility and the potential of cultural institutions, arts organizations to play a role in what we've been discussing today related to climate justice. Lola, would you like to start?
Thank you. Yes, it's a very interesting and important point, and I would say for myself, my personal view, if I were running an institution, or the kind of institution I'd like to have, isn't necessarily a model that I'd want to impose on everybody else. But I do think, to me, some of the most engaging, interesting, provocative, innovative and creative work, whether that be in a museum or an archive or an art institution, comes from thinking about the world in which we live and how much of it we would want to change and do something about. So, when you have an event, as we did last summer with Black Lives Matter protests over the murder of George Floyd, and then there was that take up amongst several British institutions of that powerful message that was coming out, something needs to change within those institutions. A number made statements about what they were going to do. Well, and anybody can make a statement. It's about what you actually do and how far your imagination will take you in terms of how you want to change what you do and how you do it. Some of those institutions will be kind of bound by the limitations of the building and the limitations of their board and their governance structures and the limitations of the staff that they have. So if you're asking me, it's about a radical rethink of all of those areas of work, just as I would ask a business, a commercial business, to radically restructure the way they think about delivering so-called profit to their shareholders, whilst at the same time trying to eliminate modern forms of slavery, address the dire climate change situation and so on. So it is, I don't think you can escape as an art institution. And I think in the past, it's gone through different phases. Victorians were actually quite good at philanthropic model around arts and cultures, and, to try and get, museums out to the masses through Exhibition Road in South Kensington in London and so on. But somehow it then got changed into something that was for a certain class of people with a certain level of education and knowledge and so on. And we're seeing a bit of a shift around that. To me, the shift just doesn't happen fast enough, and the thinking behind it doesn't really go deep enough. So those are some of the changes I'd like to see.
Thanks a lot, Lola. Farhana, would you like to pick up on the question?
Yeah, I think the role of artists, cultural organizations, heritage organizations is been one of the missing sectors, voices in the climate debate. Historically, it is fantastic that in the last, I would say 3 to 4 years, actually, that has begun to be redressed, especially as, you know, the diplomats, the politicians realize we can't reach hearts and minds about this crisis, as campaigners realize we can't reach hearts and minds just with op-eds and big tomes, you know, big IPCC reports. Just that reading the facts alone is not the wake-up call that society as a whole needs. So the more artistic ways of allowing us to connect with these issues of causality, of existence, of extinction, of survival, of cultures, you know, themselves grappling with those, I think is wonderful. And I really encourage and support, you know, the work that Hannah is doing and that others are doing. And one of the reasons I joined Julie's Bicycle as a trustee was to also help that process. And it's a recognition that maybe the approach that we took, that expertise, you know, expert knowledge in the form of legal knowledge, in the form of scientific knowledge, in the form of, you know, even the social science knowledge must be complemented with a vision and with emotions and with the lived experience that can be understood, absorbed, processed, responded to in different ways than just UN documents and submissions and papers and reports. So I've also in my life, again, one of the reasons why Extinction Rebellion was so attractive to so many people is that there was a huge artistic component, a huge emotional component. One of the things that I think that was particularly wonderful was, for example, having funeral marches. So it allowed people to grieve, you know, it allowed people to grieve for the 6th mass extinction, and it allowed permission to say, for example, to me, which is what I was feeling as a lawyer, I couldn't do my work anymore without crying or looking into the eyes of my client, the president of the Marshall Islands, and say, you know, the next COP's going to fix it, because it became impossible to hold those sets of contradictions, to hold those emotional responses. So I sort of welcome that. At the same time, I feel like going back to this question of that George posed, you know, the fundamentals of our value system are so shaped by, you know, the mainstream cultural narratives, these stories of competition, of the brutality of human nature, of, you know, always needing heroes. Usually they're white males. They're now more and more, you know, diversity suddenly is coming in the form of the Black Panther or of Wonder Woman, you know. So there's a little bit of acceptance that the hero may look different, but the underlying story is pretty much the same. And I think, you know, there's a very bleak picture painted of what humanity is, rather than celebrating its abundance and its alternatives. So I feel increasingly art isn't just a communication tool for the science, it's also a space in which we explore the vision of who we really are, who we really want to be, and take that forward. And I think that that needs to happen more and more everywhere. So one of my mantras is, you know, community is the new COP. Everything that you think you're going to go off and do in Glasgow or want to do at the next COP, do it in your community. Have those conversations, have those emotions, discuss what you need to discuss, create your, you know, sense of well-being and support systems locally, and then actually the local will help fix the global, because that's what we need more than ever. We need these positive visions, and artists and our creatives need to counter some of that very deep, powerful, you know, shaping narrative that is driving, you know, life to extinction on this planet, but promising us that we'll be able to find a hospitable Mars or an asteroid or something that we can then sort of get enough resources from. So yeah, I think just to speak to that very beautiful and powerful set of new voices, visions, creativity that's coming forward, and I'm overjoyed by that. Yeah.
Absolutely, I think that's right. I think it's also interesting to reflect on the fact, you know, that unless I'm mistaken, none of the UN SDGs actually specifically reference culture as a right, access to culture, or cultural work is being done around the SDGs, but culture isn't part of the SDGs directly, if I'm not mistaken. So maybe there's something to be done there as in terms of framing the role of culture and reshaping our ideas. But George, indeed, what you set out requires a very profound reconsideration of the very logic behind our world. How do you feel that cultural organizations could be involved in this kind of change?
I think we live in unprecedented times, and normally in unprecedented times there are also new forms of culture and art emerging, and new waves of artists in music, in theater, in literature. You know better than me, but like as a outsider and passive consumer of art, I don't feel such effervescence right now, but I might be wrong, right? I accept I might be wrong. But I think the main role of cultural organizations would be to, the moment these new forms of culture, like trying to grapple with the very difficult times we are dealing with, when these new forms of culture, and I'm not talking about just new topics within existing forms, I'm talking about new forms, and new waves normally break with dominant forms of doing things. No, I think the importance of cultural organizations there will be to give voice and space to whatever countercultural emerges, and give it the strength it needs to become more dominant and commonsensical, given all the saturation we have from the dominant narrative, the Western narrative of the individual colonizer who is dealing with problems. So I think one is, yes, I think what you're already doing, but I think it's the most important role of cultural organizations to have their antenna up for supporting these new movements, cultural production movements. The second, which I mean, I don't know about the cultural world, but what in our book, The Case for Degrowth, we argued for is that there is a need for cultural and political change at our workplaces. And my workplace is the university, but we very often tend to think outside of our workplace and outside of our own lives, and demand from politicians or demand from big changes. But what we argue in the book is that this change has to start from our own institutions. And unfortunately, as academics, we do very little in this direction. So while we are very vocal about changing the whole world of climate institutions or economic institutions, our universities become more capitalistic than ever slowly, and we just play by that. We are not members of the trade unions. We cannot stand participating in the long-held meetings where the same things are being discussed, So our universities are stuck, but then each person, their own worlds are stuck. They accept the logic of the system in their own institutions, and then they seek change outside. So without knowing much about cultural institutions, I would say that the question there is like, how do you create the world you want to see happening outside within your own institutions?
Yeah, that's a very important thing. It's something that we've learned a lot here at Onassis Stegi, and thanks also to the mentoring by Julie's Bicycle, is that you have to start by working at your own operations, your own procedures, etc., etc. And at the same time, also formulating different kinds of narratives. So you're absolutely right. It's not just about telling nice stories. It's about actually practically, technically, procedurally, humanly changing the way you go about day-to-day work. And I think that's a very important lesson to be learned from engaging with this issue. Hannah, what do you see as the role of cultural organizations, arts organizations going forward?
Yeah, I think I'll just speak to my role as a researcher, and I see a lot of opportunities for art research to be brought into these conversations. So I could see the potential, for example, of a university, an art university, creating partnerships with a specific process. For example, the process I work with, the Platform on Disaster Displacement, has an advisory committee of experts where they bring in top experts from around the world on different areas like disaster risk reduction, like refugee law, et cetera, et cetera. And I think art universities could think about what are their specific areas of expertise and the research that's ongoing in their institutions, and how, as the institution, they could create links to those processes where the research can be part of policy discussions. I think there's a lot of potential there to open up this idea of what is art research, how can it address some of the issues that are harder to address in other social science research, and all these, that there are other ways that art can add to the knowledge production, and not just in communicating science information, which is, I think, as Farhana said, I think that's where you see a lot of art research happening now. But art can do more, it can produce its own way of understanding a situation. And I think that isn't yet being fully recognized. And I think art institutions or art universities could really take the lead in helping the wider world understand the potential of art research.
Great. Well, I'd like to thank you all very, very much for being part of this discussion. It was truly very interesting, and I think a lot of important points have been made, and I hope that people will be able to come back and visit this panel session and get inspiration and practical guidance also. I'd like to thank Julie's Bicycle for having co-curated the whole climate culture event with us. And thank you all individually for taking time in very busy schedules. It would have been so great if we'd been able to meet up in Athens and have this discussion. We didn't. We saved some carbon in the process, but nonetheless, it was a very interesting and for me, very, very inspiring talk. Thank you all very, very much. And I do hope we'll be in touch in the future. Thank you very much.